Hi, good morning, and thank you for joining me on this lovely, lovely morning. I am having a cup of coffee and I'm going to take a look at a paper which is not totally new, but it is new to me. So today I'm going to take a look at the SMLT Art watercolor pad. This is 35 sheets, yes, 35, described as authentic pad in folder. So we have a really nice and somewhat unusual format for the delivery of this paper. And the paper weight is 280 GSM, just shy of 140 pounds. This is a wood-based paper that claims no cotton content. I'm hoping that in this paper we find a budget-friendly alternative to using some really expensive cotton papers and yet getting, hopefully, a bit more out of our everyday paper's performance. So let's take a look at what this paper gives us for our 16 or so USD at Blick as of the time of this recording. The first thing I notice about this pad is its unusual and very pleasing format. So this is a rugged, recycled feeling paper in a heavyweight blue stock, and the format of the pad just really makes my book nerd heart a little bit happier. We get a pad enclosed in a really beautifully made little clamshell type folio. And the process of removing the pad from the folder just slows us down and adds a nice little extra dimension to this process. It feels expensive and pleasing to take this out of its package. The pad itself folds open so that the pad cover is free, completely free of its glue-bound contents. We get a little branded insert, and it tells us more or less that there is a hashtag contest, and if you tag them, they will send you some kind of freebie. So if you're interested in that, you'll probably find an insert of this nature in your watercolor pad. My first impression, just giving this paper a once-over, is that the texture and the shallowness of the texture and the very vague ripple that this paper has reminds me a lot of Canson XL. Now, this is not necessarily a terrible thing. One of the things I like about using XL is that its texture is very low-key and does not interfere in reproduction. So if this paper gives me a little more performance in the areas where I think Canson XL fails, this could be a really good replacement for how that paper fits into my studio ecosystem. I'm going to pull one of these sheets free of the pad and give it a few simple tests. So one of the things I like to know about my paper right off the bat is how does this cope with just being taped, just having an edge taped, being taped to a board casually, not even formally stretched, just taped down. So I like to have some sense of how my paper is going to behave with that simple sort of start point expectation that I can tape things down without them getting too terribly botched just by exposure to some masking tape. As for Wet and Wet, I don't know if this is going to be your new favorite paper, but it seems to hold up okay. I can kind of play around a bit without getting into too much trouble. I'm not getting a lot of pilling just from the light lifting of scraping some of my pigment and water out of different points on the paper, and I'm just going to let this do its thing and see what I get. But so far, I feel like it's possible that the Wet and Wet behaviors of this are a little less prone to streaking than some of my experiences on XL. What I really want to see is less of the way that water pushes against itself and backsplashes and runs back away from itself on Canson. So let's just maybe do a couple more wet in wet swatches and see what we get. I feel like this paper has a Canson-like tendency to decide that any amount of puddling is too much puddling and things really sit on the surface. But I don't know, let's just give it a little time to work itself out. I'm going to challenge this with some strong pigments along one edge to see if we get smooth blending or lots of watermarks after that introduction. Just how that behaves and irons itself out over time. I want to test our layering capabilities. So this is a very lifting color by nature, an ultramarine pink. And I'm going to build up several layers of this color to see whether that's feasible or whether we get a lot of lifting on work that we've already completed and allowed to dry, and just how that color starts to stack on top of itself. I'm noticing that I'm getting a bit of premature waterline where I have a little bit of puddling. So like many wood pulp papers, overall, SMLT does not seem terribly tolerant if you get at all into the territory of any excess water. I do seem to be able to get some fairly smooth gradation, so that's nice to see and encouraging. The fact that the paper does cockle a little bit contributes, I think, to the existence of this watermark quite a bit. So the true strength of most wood pulp papers, and I would include SMLT in that grouping, is definitely a wet on dry approach to painting. I'm going to give this a couple more seconds to do its thing, and we'll see if building wet on dry is a reasonable expectation of this paper. If it fails to allow me to build layers, it's almost not worth testing whether this paper holds up to masking fluid. If I cannot use it wet in wet and I cannot use it wet on dry, there really is very little that I can do with the paper, unfortunately. So I'm going to give this a good solid amount of time to get dry and see if I can build any kind of color on top of extant color on this sheet. So we've got things pretty much dry, and some of this buckling seems to last past the point of drying. Some papers will buckle significantly and then return to form. This does not fully return to form. I'm using some diluted ultramarine pink to build value over the values that I've painted. And uses for this, different cases where I think we would use something like this might be with flower petals, botanicals, and the kind of subtle additions to our work that we would have if we're doing some wet on dry painting. Just going to kind of stow a little bit of pigment over here separately. So right away, I would say that while I'm not completely sold on or enthusiastic about the response of SMLT paper for wet in wet uses, we see a lot of whitish watermarking, a lot of kind of murky relationships of colors. This is okay down here where I keep the color family close together, and I'm very careful not to have uneven water coverage. But overall, wet in wet applications are just not the forte of this particular paper. But I do think that I'm able to get some nice wet on dry building and layering and superimposition. So I'm kind of curious to know how far I can get this to go, how many layers I can add before things start to melt together or just not work quite as well. So I'm able to build some really nice distinct value layers just using one color of watercolor. I'm going to allow this to dry and then layer an additional color over this, and this time I'll use a staining color maybe that's a little bit different from the color that I have below it, and see what kind of optical color mixing I can build gradually. So overall, what I'm thinking is that this is a good paper for wet on dry, for controlled application of water, for light washes of color, and as hinted at on the packaging of this product, this is probably a very good paper for ink and wash. So if I were to play around with this, the first thing I might experiment with is actually how this looks with some inks and building up some light washes of watercolor with water-resistant inks. So in that regard, I think this paper is probably a strong candidate for doing that well. This is not terribly uncommon, but it's always a pleasure to use a material that does this nicely. Going to use a dilute golden orange kind of color. This is a mixture of quinacridone orange with some green gold. And I just want to see if this color will layer in a subtle and transparent fashion over the ultramarine pink that I've already painted. Remember, ultramarine pink is a very easy to lift color. So what I'm looking for is a lot of disturbance versus clean, built-up edges underneath the paint that I'm adding. I have not given this a huge amount of time to dry. It would probably benefit from a little bit of additional dry time. What I'm noticing right away, much to my happiness, is that it is possible to build layer upon layer and to have visible, transparent layering shining through between layers that we add to the top. So here I have 3 layers of information which all show through individually without too much dissolving. If I go in and I deliberately try to mess things around and soften up edges and melt pigment into new areas of pigment, then yes, these layers of information will dissolve. But if I go in with a reasonable amount of care and I just stack my new color on top of my old color, manage my water, and leave everything alone, I'll get some subtlety and some building. So this is a nice paper, I think, for studying with wet on dry. And that's not exactly a huge high bar for being interested in the paper, but it is a bar that many wood pulp papers cannot meet or reach over. So overall, this paper is fairly good. I'm going to take the tape off and see what happens, because this is a point where a lot of papers will fail. Well, that is hugely disappointing. If you want to tape your edges, this is not a paper that will hold up to it. This is a very light to medium hold tape. It should not challenge this paper whatsoever, and as we see, it has challenged it massively. I can't in good conscience say that this is a paper that I would recommend anyone run out and get necessarily. I think that it's a nice possibility for some sketchbooking and some mixed media work, but unfortunately, even without running all of my normal tests, I would say that this is not something I will be restocking for myself. This is a huge bummer. I really want to like this paper, and I like small producers. The fact that it is really something that looks like it's crafted with some thought and attention makes me wish that the manufacturer would reconsider how it's formulated and really go back to the drawing board, because taping a clean edge is just something that we should all be able to do, whether we are working on wood pulp or on cotton. So I will be using my SMLT paper for pen, pencil, and light wash and illustrations that I'm probably going to wind up scanning and polishing up digitally. If you have used any paper from this company that's watercolor paper or not, and had a different type of experience with it, please let me know in the comments. I know that this company makes papers for other purposes, and it still occurs to me that these could be very nice to use. I'd love to hear about your thoughts and your experiences down below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, paint happy, and create something awesome. Thanks for watching, and bye.